Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Crowd Chatter Podcast. Today is going to be some more Bubble Watch videos. I already explained this in my last one, but if you guys did not see the last one, this is the first one you're seeing. I did this series last year. Um, if you've ever seen the Bubble Watch stuff on ESPN where they do this, you know what I'm doing pretty much already. You already know pretty much how this goes. Um, so I'm gonna get this video started. Let's not take too long with this. I'm starting with the ACC, and the first team I'm going to do, and the only team that I'm actually going to do from the ACC is Clemson. This is a very interesting team because this team had a uh, very good start to the season. They were incredibly hot. They had lot of really good wins, especially one on the road against Alabama. And they also have a win over Boise State, which is really good. They also beat South Carolina and TCU. All of those are very good non-conference wins, and all of those probably will qualify, should easily qualify, honestly, as quad ones. And then they took a loss to Memphis, obviously. And then you get to the actual conference, and they had a tough time getting wins. The loss to Miami, loss to North Carolina, loss to Virginia Tech. They beat Boston College, lost to Georgia Tech, lost to Duke, lost now to Virginia. I mean, they are currently 4-6 in the conference, which is a very poor record. But the thing is, with all those non-conference wins against so many good teams, they've kind of built up a solid resume, honestly, even with a lot of, really not impressive, with a lot of tough losses within the conference. Now, they do have one huge opportunity. I'm recording this on the 5th of February. They have a huge opportunity coming tomorrow as they actually do play on the road in Chapel Hill against North Carolina, which is their lone game still left against a top 25 team. Obviously, North Carolina's number three. So if you win that game, you're in pretty good shape. But I mean, that's really their only other opportunity because the only ranked team left is Duke, and they just lost to the next best ACC team, which is Virginia, and they lost that one by one. But really, that's like Clemson's only opportunity really that's left. Because other than that, they got a bunch of really not special teams. Maybe teams that are like hanging on the bubble. One of them being Miami, who's not had the season they were hoping for. But really, their last chance for a big win is tomorrow against North Carolina. But this Clemson team just if it were to happen now, I think they're in pretty good position to make it to the tournament. I think this kind of happened last year to Clemson too, where they had a really good start to the season, had a lot of really good early wins, and then collapsed when it came to the ACC. So I don't know what was it with the ACC that Clemson just can't make happen. But this was similar to last season, and already we're seeing kind of seeing a repeat. But they have a better resume, I think, this year non-conference than they did last year. So that definitely really helps Clemson's case. Next up, we go with the Big 12, and this is a very deep conference. So there's a lot of teams really that come out of the Big 12. We had a lot already in terms of locks. And now we're going to have a lot in terms of should be in. And the first one is TCU. The TCU Horned Frogs have a solid resume. With being in the Big 12, yeah, all the Big 12 teams kind of beat up on each other. Everybody has a good win here, a good win there, has a tough loss here, tough loss there. It's very difficult for teams in the Big 12 because there's just so many good teams that it makes it tough for all of them to be able to succeed really well. I mean, TCU, They beat Oklahoma. They beat Houston. They beat Baylor. They beat Texas Tech. I mean, those are all very good teams in the Big 12. But they also lost Cincinnati, Iowa State, Cincinnati, Iowa State, Texas, Kansas. I mean, they lost to all of them. They're 5-4 in the Big 12. So I mean, it's just it's tough because of how many good teams there are in this conference. And really, everybody in this conference is pretty much in conversation, other than like a few, to go into the tournament. So that alone does make it much more difficult for teams in the Big 12 because really, you don't. I mean, if you remember the days of when the Big Ten was just absolutely dynamite and like every team was pretty much in the tournament conversation, other than like Northwestern, Nebraska, because they like always sucked, and then sometimes Minnesota. Like, and every other team was pretty much in tournament conversation. That's essentially where the Big 12 is this year. Every team is pretty much directly in the middle of the conversation, except for like two or three. And that's what makes it so difficult in the Big 12 is just the amount of depth that it has. Because no game do you get to just kind of you'll never get time, you'll never get a break. You don't ever get some time off to relax. You're like you gotta bring your best to every game, or you're going to get punched in the mouth, and it's not gonna feel good. So, that's the beauty of the Big 12 is just how much competition there is. But TCU, I think, if the tournament were to happen today, is in a pretty good spot to make it. And then next for the Big 12, I'm gonna go with a newcomer for the conference, and that is BYU. Coming in the first season this year for BYU in the Big 12. Of course, first for Houston, who I have listed as a lock. But this is the first year for BYU in the Big 12, and for football they were an independent. For basketball, they played in the WCC with St. Mary's, Gonzaga, those types of teams. And BYU, they find themselves now in the Big 12, which is by far much difficult than the West Coast Conference. And they're ranked. I mean, they're 21. Hey, they have some solid wins. I mean, they've beaten some good teams. Even in the non-conference, they've beaten some good teams within the conference. So I mean, this BYU team has played pretty doggone well, and they've been very good really all season long. They're 60-5. I'm stopping short of listing them as a lock just because they have a lot of tough games still coming. And they do have, the one. Well, they don't really have any glaring losses. They have a tougher schedule coming up still. They have some tougher teams that they still need to beat, and I'd like to see them actually still play them and beat them before I go ahead and put them as an actual lock for the NCAA tournament. But BYU is looking like they're on their way to a tournament bid. To me, it's just probably a matter of time. Next for the Big 12, we're going down here to find there they are, the Texas Tech Red Raiders. This team came out of absolutely nowhere. I think the first team that actually made it to the NCAA tournament for Texas Tech, like when they first became really relevant. I think were the Chris Beard days. That was when Texas Tech really showed up and when the Red Raiders really started looking pretty good. Early in the year, it did not look like Texas Tech would be much of anything. It just looked like they'd be a very ordinary team that would be, maybe right on the cut line or something. But Texas Tech has played their way to really being in a solid position to make the tournament. I mean, they jumped to 15 last week after some solid wins, and then they took some losses to TCU and Cincinnati, and now they will head to Baylor tomorrow night on the road. So that's a huge game for the Raiders of Texas Tech, Red Raiders, that is. But Texas Tech's got a solid team. They once again, this is a good basketball team. They have Pop Isaacs, who's a very good basketball player. He was pretty good for them last year. He's been even better for them this season. That's obviously their best player. They do have an Iowa transfer actually, and Joe Toussaint, who's a solid offensive player as well. If you remember his days from the Iowa Hawkeyes, he was a solid playmaker for him. He mostly came off the bench, but Joe Toussaint did deliver them solid minutes. He is playing a starting role for the Red Raiders at Texas Tech and is doing pretty well with it. There's a lot of transfers for Texas Tech. Most of the guys of which they have all are from like other teams this season's pretty much a mix and match of a lot of guys. But Texas Tech's got a solid team. I think if the tournament were to happen today, they're in pretty good shape to make it to the tournament. And same goes for the next team, even though they've kind of disappeared in recent weeks, and as Oklahoma. They had a really nice start to the year. I think this is kind of a similar team to Clemson. They had a hot start to the season. They were looking fantastic to start the year. And then as the year just kind of went along, they kept on taking L after L after L, and they couldn't stop. But this team, that's the only problem for them is I don't think they have as many good wins as some of the other ones in their conference, like a BYU or TCU or something like that. They're non-con, unlike Clemson, I think that's what I'm trying to compare it to. Oklahoma's non-conference is nowhere near as good as Clemson. Oklahoma does have a win over Providence. The wins over Iowa and USC, people thought would be good later on, but both those teams have ended up sucking now. So that really does them absolutely nothing. So that really is unfortunate if you're Oklahoma. But the Providence win will look good for them. They also have wins over and then they also do have a win in the conference over Iowa State, which is a very good win for them. Even over Cincinnati on the road is pretty good. They beat Kansas State on the road. They have a big one coming up against TCU. They have Baylor and Kansas as well coming up. Those are all huge games for Oklahoma. They need some big wins, and they need to get them soon to kind of get their season back on track because they've taken a lot of home L's, which really does not bode well for them. Losing a lot of games, they've lost a couple games at home within the conference, losing two of them actually straight to Texas and Texas Tech. Um, Oklahoma needs some wins for sure, but I think still if the tournament were to happen today, OU's in. Next, we go to the Big East, which I'm going to go with the first team here that I have listed. I gotta get to the Big East first for this one, and I'm gonna stick with them. Uh, and I think I'm going to still just stick with them. It's gonna be harder now. Well, you know what? I'm actually gonna downgrade them. It's not looking as sharp anymore. This team, though, I'm definitely putting here, and for the Big East, I'm actually gonna stick with the one, just because the other teams are kind of falling off a bit, and I'm going with Seton Hall. This Seton Hall team, they did actually take a couple L's in that Oklahoma tournament I was talking about. Seton Hall ended up losing both to Iowa and USC, which is not all that pretty. They also lost to Rutgers, which also isn't really that pretty. Uh, Baylor's not a terrible loss for them. That's a solid team. So their early season for them was not all that was not what they were obviously hoping for. Seton Hall also did beat Missouri, but that doesn't really help them. But the big wins for Seton Hall really come within the conference, where they have wins over Providence on the road, and then both Marquette and UConn at home. Those are the huge wins. They also have a win over Butler on the road. So I mean, they have some huge wins within the conference. They did also lose to Xavier, which is really not the greatest team. So that doesn't really look that sharp for the what was it, Pirates, I believe, for Seton Hall. I'm pretty sure it's the Pirates. Uh, Correct me if I'm wrong on that. Yeah, it is the Pirates. Okay. But Seton Hall, this is a very good team. This is a solid team. This was a Kevin Willard team, and and Kevin Willard's teams were infamous for being very tough. But now it's Shaheen Holloway's team, and they're still playing pretty well. I mean, they're 7-4 in the Big East Conference, which is honestly pretty good. They have a solid 14-8 record, which also is pretty solid. They have some wins against or I'm sorry, they have some games against some rather unspecial competition coming up, with their next three games being Georgetown, Villanova, and Xavier. Weird to say that those three teams are not great competition, but none of those teams. Maybe Villanova. I know some think Villanova might be the only team in that list that is like maybe tournament worthy. Xavier definitely not. Or at least I wouldn't think so. I know they had some wins lately, but they're not good. Um, they had a really rough start to the year. It's kind of hard for me to really put them on there, but Xavier, maybe it depends on how many more wins they keep getting. If they keep rolling, they keep getting some more wins, they might get in the conversation. But they need to keep winning, which I'm not really sure they can keep doing that. That's the big problem for them. But Seton Hall, they got a good resume. They got a solid team. Like I said, they have an above average conference record. They have a kind of average record. But with that above average conference record, to win over both UConn and Marquette, those are both enormous. I like Seton Hall's chances. I got them sitting pretty here, atop of the Big East. Um, I'll keep them where they are. The next team, I'm gonna stick with them, but their positioning has gotten a bit more problematic with some recent losses. But I'm going to stick with them as a should be in team. I think they still would be in should the tournament happen today. I don't know where they are. There they are. I'm going with the Providence Friars. This team still has some really good wins. I mean, they in the non-conference they beat Wisconsin, which has obviously turned out to be very good. They did lose to Kansas State and Oklahoma. But they also beat Marquette at home, so they obviously have those two wins. They did lose to Seton Hall and Creighton, as well as St. John's and Xavier. That was a ugly 4-game stretch. But they had beaten Seton Hall, but they got back against Seton Hall, getting them on the road. They did lose to UConn and Villanova lately, though. Now they have a big game coming up against the Creighton Blue Jays. That probably is a game they need to win. Depending on what happens in that game, I might drop them to work to do. But right now, I'm going to keep them as a should be in team just because I love their non conference resume. That Wisconsin win is just absolutely huge. And then that Marquette win really stands out. And then even Butler's been really good this year. The Seton Hall win's solid as well. So those are all good wins for Providence. None of their losses are necessarily bad, other than maybe the Xavier one, because it is kind of glaring, and then maybe Nova, but I don't even know about that. Nova's still a good team. So I'll stick with Providence here. Obviously that positioning may come into doubt later, but I'll stick with the Friars uh, where they are. And then we got the Big Ten. And you remember earlier when I said the Big Ten was not really all that special, and they kind of lacked lacked a lot of depth, and they just weren't, and they only had a couple good teams. Well, that yeah, this is what I mean. Next team. The only team I have in the should be in category coming from the Big Ten is Northwestern, and the Wildcats have had a solid season. They have some interesting wins. They have some interesting losses. They've been all over the place. That's for sure. They have been a roller coaster, to say the least, as they have a not they have a non-conference win actually over Dayton, which is strangely, as much as this might seem crazy, actually right now is really stinking good because Dayton has actually ended up becoming a top 25 team. They did lose a Mississippi State in the non-conference, but their win, of course, over Purdue is just absolutely gigantic. That Purdue win at home really stands out. Their Chicago State loss is the really glaring one. Yeah, yeah, they lost to Chicago State. Which obviously that's pretty bad. So that one obviously really is glaring. But they also beat Illinois at home. They also beat Illinois at home, which obviously is another really good win for them. Um, and they also beat Michigan State as well. So I mean they have a couple decent wins. That's why I have them as should be in because with their wins really over Dayton, Purdue, and Illinois, they have plenty of good enough wins to kind of offset that ugly looking Chicago State loss that I still can't understand how. Well, no, I actually do. Michigan would too. Uh, yeah, that's how bad we are. But Northwestern, they're just a weird team because they have some really good wins, but then that Chicago State loss is like wow. Um, but Northwestern, crazy enough, that might not even be worse than Michigan. But Northwestern, they find themselves here as the only team from the Big Ten to be in the should be in category. As for the Pac-12, yeah, I no, there's nobody from here. Pac-12, like I said, Arizona is like the only good team that really comes out of that conference. Like everybody else is just really uninspiring, which is really interesting. You know, they just no one else is really all that good, um, and just really has not had that impressive of a season. So I mean, I would try and put somebody else in there, but there's just nobody else to really put there. So really next I go with the SEC. Most people would probably argue that this team is a lock, and honestly, they probably are. But I just look at their resume and don't really see much of anything that wows me in terms of like the wins that they have. They probably are locked just because of their record, but I have Auburn as a should be in team. They're obviously ranked number 12. They're obviously 18-4, which is pretty doggone good. They will have Alabama coming up, and they do have pretty much the heart of their schedule coming up here, as they'll have Alabama, Florida, South Carolina, Kentucky, and Tennessee all coming up with all in this coming month. So if they win those games, they obviously will be a lock. If they lose a lot of them, which I think is very possible, they could find themselves staring down the bottom of the barrel because there's not really a lot of good wins for them. I mean, they have a season sweep of Ole Miss, which is pretty good, but they lost to Bama, they lost to Mississippi State. They have an Appalachian State loss, which honestly, I mean, Appalachian State has a good record, but that's not necessarily one you want to have. They did lose to Baylor earlier in the year as well, but Baylor is a good team. But for Auburn, it's like I want to put them as a lock, but it's like they got that really tough schedule coming up. If they go and beat Bama and Florida, I'll list them as a lock. I think at that point they'd be in pretty good shape. I don't think there'd be any reason that they would drop out. But they don't really have a good win yet. They are 18-4 though, so I'd say they're pretty much as much of a lock as they're pretty close to a lock as you can get. But speaking of, I was talking about Ole Miss and how Auburn had a season sweep over them. Well, speaking of the Rebels, there should be in team. I mean, Ole Miss, I did say that, and you can barely kind of see that. logo, but that is supposed to be Ole Miss. But Ole Miss, they ended up actually winning the Chris Beard sweepstakes after he was fired from Texas because of I think it was sexual assault allegations, which ended up just being dropped or something. I don't remember. I'd have to look it up, but Ole Miss had a really, really good start to the season as they went through the entire year of 2023 um, without taking a loss. They went 13 and 0. But then they went to January, and their first day in the new year of 2024, they got spanked by Tennessee. But this Ole Miss team still is pretty good. As I said, they have the same record as Auburn at 18 and 4, with two of their losses coming against Auburn. With neither one of them really being all that close. But they do have some big games coming up here soon. They'll have South Carolina twice. They will have Kentucky and Alabama, as well as Mississippi State, all this month. So this is also going to be a huge month for Ole Miss. This is kind of like a make or break month for them because they don't really have all that great of a win. I mean, they have NC State. That's not going to do much for them. UCF won't do much for them. Memphis is a decent win. So that one is actually a solid one, but it's not going to think I'd be enough. They also have Florida. Uh, I don't know if that one's really going to be enough for them, but if they can get one of South Carolina, Kentucky, or Alabama, that would work really well for Ole Miss. And they have two shots against the Gamecocks, which really works for them because that's the other team that's obviously come out of absolutely nowhere this year. Which actually, their first shot against South Carolina will be on the road, and that will happen tomorrow night. Where they'll play, they'll play on the road against the newly 15th ranked Gamecocks. So big game for Ole Miss, as well as South Carolina, even to keep their incredible season going. But definitely for Ole Miss, who's 18 and 4, honestly got a really good record, but just not really much to show for it. And then next we're gonna go to the just others category. These are just like teams from any other conference that's not in one of the Power Six. Um, and so this is kind of like a miscellaneous category. Just throw your team in here more or less. And there's a lot of teams that are going to go in here. And the first one I'm going to go with, I haven't paid much attention to these teams. In fact, I haven't really paid that much attention to college basketball in general. I watch. Well, I watch way more than I have this year, but this year I just have not been watching nearly as much as normal. But I've still been paying attention, of course. But the first team I have as a should be in team is going to be Utah State. And this is not at all the last one. There's a lot more. But Utah State has had a pretty darn good season. The Utah State Aggies, they have some solid non. They had a solid non-conference. They did have a loss to Bradley, but they beat literally everybody else. And then within their conference, you wouldn't believe it, but the Mountain West Conference is pretty good this year. With Utah State, they got a win over Boise State. They have a win over Colorado State. They did lose to San Diego State. But this Utah State team has a lot of pretty good wins. They really, and they did beat Santa Clara too in San Francisco, but I don't think those two are really going to give them much of anything in terms of resume value. But beating Colorado State as well as Boise State, both of those wins are pretty good for Utah State. Those definitely worked for them. So I got the Aggies as a should be in team. Next, I'm going to go with another, and like I said, there's a lot of Mountain West teams, so I'm just going to keep going through them. Next Mountain West team, I have New Mexico. And this team was, they were an interesting one last year, too, because the Lobos, there they are. New Mexico Lobos, they had like a really good start to the year last year. They were like undefeated for I think a while. They were like 15 or 16-0 or something. And then in the Mountain West, they just got absolutely pummeled, and they could not beat anybody in the Mountain West. I mean, they absolutely crumbled, and it knocked them out of the tournament. So this year's been a lot different. They did lose to St. Mary's early on in the year, but they ended up also pretty much winning every other non-conference game. Not that there really was much of anybody that was any good in the non-conference. But then when it got to the conference, they beat both San Diego State and Utah State, both of which are very good wins. They took L's to Colorado State and UNLV, and they also lost to Boise State. But those wins over San Diego State and Utah State, both are very good. Um, and New Mexico's they have a really good they have a solid resume. They also killed Nevada, who's pretty good. Um, New Mexico's got some good wins over some good teams. San Diego State, like I said, being one of them. They have a solid resume over and have got some good wins. So I like where their resume is at. I like the teams that they've beaten, and really what they have put together works pretty well. And then the next team I'm gonna have as a should be in team. I really only list this team as a should be in team because I really have no idea. I mean, this team really, I guess you could list them almost as a lock because their season has been that good. But I don't really know because they don't have a great win. Well, they keep winning and they really get ahead because there's one team that's ahead of them, which I think is the only team that beat them within the conference. Yeah, there's one team that's ahead of them, and if they can jump ahead of them in the conference standings, I honestly probably would make them a should be in team, or probably a lock. But right now, I'm just gonna keep them in should be in, and that is Dayton. And the Dayton Flyers, I'll put them ahead of both of them actually. But the Dayton Flyers, they have a very good record. I'm sorry, that's not them. They are 18-3. Their only losses come against Northwestern, Houston, and then in their conference, one to Richmond on the road. I think they're as close to a lock as you're gonna get. They've had. I mean, this is almost Obi Toppin esque. If you remember when he was at remember when he was at Dayton and that Dayton team that would have been probably pretty darn good in the tournament, but obviously that was the COVID year, so never really that never really got to happen. And so that was kind of disappointing because that was when San Diego State had some really stupidly good year too, and they were gonna be like the number one seed. That was a really weird year in general. But the Dayton Flyers, that's a really good season. I'm sticking them here at should be in, but subject to change really. Is kind of how I would put it. Next up is gonna be San Diego State. That's gonna be my next team as a lock. Once again, another team from the Mountain West. There's a lot of really good Mountain West teams this year. It's just really interesting to see how many of them there are. But San Diego State, they got another. I mean, they actually had a bit of some expectations coming into this year, considering they went to the Final Four a year ago. Um, they took an early loss at BYU, but they beat St. Mary's, which is gonna end up being a pretty good win for them. They beat Gonzaga on the road. You would normally think that that's a really good win, but Gonzaga really has not been that sharp. However, it is on the road, which honestly makes a big difference. So that's a nice win for them. San Diego State also in the conference ended up beating Utah State. They also have a win over Nevada as well. San Diego State's got some solid wins. They have a solid resume really, and this team, considering they went to the Final Four a year ago, um, they have I think they got the resume for it, and that's the big thing. So I'm going with San Diego State as my next should be in team. Now I do have still a few more, so bear with me because it is a long list. The next one I'm gonna go with here is probably one of the weirdest teams in college basketball because of just how wildly inconsistent they seem to be. Because they never can seem to really get on track. But I'm gonna go. They never seem to just really get in shape, and that's the Memphis Tigers. Memphis had an unbelievable start to the year, and they got themselves ranked. They were playing really good basketball. They beat Texas A&M, who's honestly not a bad team. Which that I mean, early in the year they barely beat Michigan, which ended up not looking too good. They beat Arkansas, who also didn't end up looking too good. Then lost to Nova, but they lost to Ole Miss. But then they beat Texas A&M. They beat Clemson. They beat Virginia, all of which are very good teams. Then they get to the conference, and they end up barely beating Tulsa. They barely beat SMU. They squeaked by UTSA. They put a stupid amount of points on Wichita State. Then they lost to USF. Then they lost to Tulane. Then they lost to UAB. Then they lost to Rice. And then they finally beat Wichita State by 2. So I mean, it's been a rough, really rough stretch for Memphis, who was 15-2, was looking really doggone good, was 10th in the country, and then just kind of hit a slump. Just kind of not able to get a win, continued taking losses, and some of those teams really that I mentioned are not really all that special, especially Rice. Rice is really bad. Um, but Memphis, they have a decent resume. So I mean, they need to get some more wins to kind of, they finally it seems like they maybe have they finally righted the ship. They need to get some more wins now to kind of continue righting that ship. But they definitely need to reel it back in here. They got some easier games again coming up. Start rallying off some more wins. And then you got 2 shots against FAU at the end of the year. Both of those will come in huge. You definitely need those games. But Memphis is a solid team. Like I said earlier, they're kind of all over the place, but they have a good resume. They're an overall good team. So definitely something to look at for the Tigers. I think they go here. And then we have 2 more teams still to come, believe it or not, from the Mountain West. Just because, I mean, 'cause like I said, this Mountain West Conference just has a bevy of outstanding basketball teams. And I'm trying to decide between which one I want to go with first. They're actually both should be right around here somewhere. There's the other one. Yeah, okay. Um, so I'm gonna go with this one first. I'm gonna go with Colorado State. Colorado State had a really good start to the year. They bombed Creighton, which really looks good for them. Even their win over Colorado is a pretty good win for them. They did ended up losing later on to St. Mary's, which obviously St. Mary's is a decent team. Then Colorado State would get to the conference, and then they had a bit of a hard time. They did beat New Mexico, which does look good for them. They ended up losing to Utah State and Boise State, as well as Nevada and Wyoming. They did beat San Diego State, though, just recently. And they'll have some shots still coming up against teams like Boise State, San Diego. Oh, they have a shot against everybody still. Boise State, San Diego State, Utah State, New Mexico, and Nevada, all still coming up for Colorado State all this month. This is a big month for a lot of different teams, but Colorado State still got a lot of good shots coming up against some big teams. You win, say, half of those games. You beat, say, they got home against Utah State and Boise State. Say they beat New Mexico and Utah State, or say San Diego State and Boise State. I think they're in pretty good shape. You split the difference there. I think the Buffalo, or I think the Rams, Colorado State's the Rams. The Buffaloes are the other Colorado team. um, Colorado State, I think, would be in pretty good shape should they win those games. And then the last team, finally, from the Mountain West, is Boise State. The Boise State Broncos also are having a pretty good season. In the non-conference, they weren't really they weren't as good as some of the other Mountain West teams in the non-conference. They did beat San Francisco, but the San Francisco I don't think has really done all of that much really. I mean, they have a solid record, but they have like zero good wins, and they didn't beat Gonzaga or St. Mary's, so yeah, that makes it tough for them. But they did. But Boise State. They lost to Clemson. They lost to Virginia Tech. They lost to Butler. All of which are opportunities for them. They could have used one of them, but they didn't win any of those games. They did beat St. Mary's though in the non-conference, which does bode well for them. They lost to Washington State, who's honestly a decent team. But then came the conference, and Boise State really only two losses within the Mountain West, which, like I said, pretty good actually. And they got wins over both Colorado State and New Mexico, which are both good teams. And also San Diego State as well, along with Nevada. So Boise State's got a lot of good non-conference wins. They still have more opportunities coming up. But considering the wins that they have, I think they're in pretty good shape to go to the NCAA tournament. And that is finally, after all those teams in the others category, that's finally where we end this video. A lot of teams in the Mountain West. It really is quite strange to see 5 different teams from the Mountain West in conversation, and all teams of which, I think a good majority of people would say is in pretty good position to go to the tourney. But that's it for this video. I hope you all enjoyed it, and I'll see you on the next one. So until then, adios, everyone.